Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you diddling, Ken?
I'm doing well today, Rory. Thank you so much for asking. We hope that you are doing well. You've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 257, with lots of content to cover today, starting off with the all-important theory in practice, where we take an element of theory and look at how that presents itself within the therapy room. And today, we're going to be speaking about locus of evaluation. Really interesting little piece of theory, and certainly one I struggled with when I was studying. We're going to be deep diving into that, looking how that shows itself in practice. Then we move on to practice today. That's where we take a contemporary challenge, win, or something that's going on in the world of counselling, and we discuss it as peers. And today we're going to be speaking about meeting a client in a social setting. You're out and about, and then suddenly there's a client at the event you're at or at the restaurant you're at. How do we act and interact within those settings? And then thirdly, we go on to practice matters. That is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, where we bring the experts to you. And today it is Tayba Azim, supporting Muslim clients with their mental health. That is a interview that you undertook, Rory.
Yes, absolutely, Ken. And it's one not to be missed. It speaks to diversity and knowing the other, something that I think all therapists need to strive to do.
Well, let's get straight into it. We're speaking theory in practice, and we're speaking about locus of evaluation. What is that? Well,
it was a key piece of theory from Carl Rogers, and it sits very much in the canon of person-centered therapy. And I was struck by a quote. I was reading the Carl Rogers Reader by Richard Kirstenbaum, and it's a compilation of Rogers' work. So if you're a student, the Carl Rogers Reader is a pretty good book to have, because it kind of compresses a lot of the volumes of books that he has. It was, in fact, the only book I could afford when I was a student, so I bought that. And he says, as humans grow from infancy to adulthood, an internal rift gradually develops, a rift that separates our immediate awareness from our own deeper experiencing. In order to receive approval and love, we learn to suppress those feelings and expressions of ourselves that are deemed unacceptable to the important caretakers in our lives. What a powerful piece of writing. And of course, Rogers was speaking to child development. I think it's sometimes forgotten that Rogers was a child therapist for a long time when he worked at Rochester for the children's home that he worked at, as he developed the idea of person-centered therapy. He must have seen this a lot. And what happens is, of course, is that sometimes we lose our real selves. We lose who we really are and live to conditions of worth of others. And the locus of evaluation, of course, is evaluating who we really are, finding our real self.
I like it. So if we take the words locus of evaluation, locus can be kind of translated for me and my understanding into location, locus. Where is it coming from? The locus, the center, the seed of the evaluation. Evaluation is kind of how we measure something, I guess. We're evaluating that. And there are two flavors of locuses of evaluation. The first one is called internal locus of evaluation. So where we evaluate from internally, our true inner self, we are creating that evaluation of what we see and how we behave within a given set of circumstances. And it would kind of indicate, if we're working from an internal locus of evaluation, that we trust our own inner feelings, our organismic self, to be able to make the right decision and present as we truly are within that interaction or circumstance. Then an external locus of evaluation takes the locus, the place where it is, from internal, not within us, but externally. And this would kind of indicate that we would be acting in a way to please others, to appear better to others, to kind of impress or do the right thing or be accepted by others. So we're no longer acting from how we really are internally, we're acting in a way of how we perceive people want us to be, the external locus of evaluation. And I guess when we see this, we may see this in our therapy room with a client who maybe doesn't trust their own feelings, their own decisions, their own ways of acting and interacting within their lives. They are trying to be what they perceive others would want them to be. And I guess the theory indicates that the work is moving more towards an internal locus of evaluation, where we disregard those introjected values, the values of others, and we accept our own experience of the world and our own true organismic self as the true essence for how we act and react within a social setting or any kind of interaction, Rory.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. Locus of evaluation is really the view of ourselves. That would be a kind of decoded view of it, really. Our own view, our own internal view, or the view of others, and we act to that. And, Ken, it struck me when I was doing the research for this podcast that there's another aspect to this that perhaps even Carl Rogers may not have been aware of. And the reason that he may not have been aware of it, he left us in 1987, he died in 1987, was that over the years, we've begun to see the emergence of neurodiversity.
Yeah.
People who are autistic, sometimes they would refer to themselves as autists. And we know that for some in the autistic community, they mask themselves. In other words, they have to appear to be neurotypical because they fear the judgments of others. They fear that if they're their real selves, and I have an autistic grandson, and my daughter has autism, and that fear of being themselves, being their autistic selves, not so much for my grandson, but being their autistic selves, what happens is that they may feel judged or not be able to be themselves. And I'm very grateful to a comment I picked up in someone's Twitter feed, and forgive me if it's you that's written this, forgive me, I can't attribute it to you, but it was someone who's saying that you don't particularly need, in the case of the locus of evaluation and acceptance, the therapist acceptance, you don't particularly need any special training to work with someone who's neurodiverse. You just need to be accepting. You just need to really apply the theory and be accepting. And hopefully, if you do that, people in your therapy room will be themselves. What a joy, Ken. What a joy to be yourself.
Yeah, it is. And we live in an age now where I guess it's very social media driven. And is the social media portrayal of you the real you? Or is it the you that you want to show the world because that's what the world accepts and that's what you believe the world wants to see? And then that's just a rhetorical question that you can kind of think about yourself. But it is it seems like we're acting more and more from those external locuses of evaluations. We're seeing it more and more because there's a lot of pressure, I guess, within society to conform to certain norms. And you're speaking about neurotypical and neurodiversity there, Rory. And the neurodiversity kind of lives in a world that is set up as a neurotypical world. So there is this unwritten, unsaid set of rules that we need to conform to. And I myself am neurodiverse, and I lived for over 50 years without even knowing I was doing it. And I think that is the important part here. When a client is presenting from an external locus of evaluation, they're not aware of the theory of locus of evaluation, internal and external. For them, that is reality. They see it as how it is. So an example might be, I'm just going to use an example. You're in a restaurant and you order your meal, and your meal comes, and I don't know, you've ordered a steak, and the steak is really tough and it's overdone and it's not as you asked it to be. And then a minute later, a waiter or a waitress would come to the table and say, "How's everything going?" If we go, "Oh, it's fine, thank you. Oh, I'm not coming here again." That is an external locus of evaluation. I don't want that person to feel hurt or kind of look at me in a negative light. I don't want to upset them. I don't want to, I know they're busy. So I'm making a decision that kind of compromises myself within that moment. What kind of a feeling goes on inside when that kind of transaction plays out versus, is everything okay? Actually, no. I asked for it such a way, and I'm finding it such a way. Internal locus of evaluation. But internal locus of evaluation sometimes, well, first of all, it takes knowing who you are. So personal development gets you there. And secondly, it takes an act of courage to be your true self. There was an advert on television, some footballer in a press conference, and eventually he says, "I can't be who you want me to be anymore," and he storms out. And that's the advert. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. The dude's gone to his internal locus of evaluation. How often are we playing parts in our lives? We're being who others want us to be, in our work, in our relationships, in our own families sometimes. It's an interesting concept, and it can hold a client back. It can hold a client back where a client is looking at their situation, speaking about the experiences they're having, and acting in a way which is not congruent to themselves. They're acting in a way to please others or be somebody for others. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to play that part. It's almost like you're an actor playing a part in your own life. You can't really be you. You've got to be an actor, and sometimes playing a different part in different settings, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all find ourselves, sometimes having to be slightly incongruent. I think it's a big ask to be congruent all the time, because there are times when you just can't be. I've certainly said on occasions, meeting someone who, shall I say, I may not rather spend time with, when I've said, "Oh, it's lovely to see you again," which really what I'm thinking is, oh dear, this person's here. I'll make the best of it, and then I'll make a sharp exit. And we do that. They're social kind of norms that we adapt. But I think it's this. I think I'm going to pick up on what you were saying about this, work that's done in therapy. This kind of internal investigation of who we are and what's important to us, and that's the work of therapy, isn't it? Where someone comes along, and we start that process of personal development. We start to be more of who we are and less of what other people want us to be. Mm-hmm. And one of the quotes, many quotes that I've come across on this, is from a man called John Schleen. I mentioned him on the podcast before. He was a student of Rogers. He was probably the greatest exponent of person-centered therapy in America. And he has a wonderful quote, and he says, "Everyone knows everything. This is not a theory of knowledge. It is that you, we know everything about ourselves. There may be defenses, denials, cover-ups, faults, and interferences and overloads in memory. But we know, we are the ultimate source.
Oh,
Isn't that
powerful.
just beautiful? And if you want that quote and the citation, I'll pop it into the show notes. All you have to do to get there is go to counsellingtutor.com, find the podcast tab. It's episode 257. We'll pop that quote in. Very handy for assignments, methinks.
Yeah, if you're doing person-centered, definitely.
Yeah.
So let's take that theory and kind of bring it into our therapy room. What might we see? So a client may come in. I'm just going to use random examples here. So maybe a client comes in and says, my partner thinks that I should come to counselling. That would be an external locus of evaluation. They're using a separate person to themselves for the reason that they might be sitting in front of you. And a soft challenge back might be something like, and I wonder how you feel about that. What do you think? And then looking at that person, do they stay in that external, well, they said that I act like this and that I'm doing too much of that and I'm doing too much of the next thing. Maybe that's still staying in that external locus of evaluation. And again, gently and with empathy, coming back and saying, and so I hear that you're saying that they see that within you, but how is it for you? What are you feeling? And even if we get just that tiniest little bit of, well, actually, I think that blah, 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 and they bring a little bit of themselves, what we can do as the therapist is we can look at that, put our attention there, and then treat whatever it is they bring with that unconditional positive regard that you mentioned earlier, Rory. That is the way of being for that when a person does bring a little bit of themselves. And we may see that with clients where they kind of test the water with us, where they gingerly put out a little bit of themselves to see, is this going to be acceptable? They may test the relationship. And when that is welcomed with unconditional positive regard on an ongoing basis, along with our empathy and our conditions and, of course, of our modality and our skills, what we can recognize there is that the person becomes freer and freer to be themselves within the therapy relationship. We can almost see that moving away from that external locus of evaluation to owning who they are, their own emotions, how they feel, how they act and react within their life and interactions. And when that is treated with that unconditional positive regard, it is warmly welcomed. It can do a lot. So we're talking about patience and we're talking about those core conditions holding that client can do so much in kind of, I guess, gently challenging the external locus of evaluation. Yes, I hear that that's what they say, but I wonder, how is that really for you? What do you feel? What do you think? What do you, and how do you experience that? And bringing it back to their locus of evaluation. And as the therapist, trusting their locus of evaluation, not the external locus of evaluation that others may be putting on them. Because so often a client might be operating from an external locus of evaluation because they don't trust what they feel and what they experience inside.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess the therapist is almost a vitamin in the relationship, in that they provide a condition, an attitude, a place where the client can start to experiment and find out and have that internal discussion of who they are. And, it can sometimes be a long process. And, for those people who've worked to extreme conditions of worth, where they've been told they're only loved if they do what they are told, it can take a long time for someone to unpick what are the external drivers, if you like, to their behavior and what internally they want. And sometimes, not to put too fine a point on it, it can be a bit of a rough road. It can be things like separations, divorces, leaving work, leaving families. Certainly for, those in the LGBTQ plus community, it can be a very difficult emergence, depending on how accepting and the messages that they've had from those who love them. And, I've certainly, had colleagues who've taken a long time to, I think the term is sometimes coming out. I think maybe a bit of an old-fashioned term now, but, we'll use that term because it's the one I know. And it can be a very difficult road to travel, which is why a therapist really needs to stick in for the long term, dig in for the long term, and be there for the client. You literally sometimes both on a boat in the middle of a storm, and you have to be there for the client. You have to be in those choppy seas and that bad emotional weather. And hopefully, the storm's clear, the sun rises, the winds are fair, and the client sails off into their destination, feeling that they are themselves. It's part of the work, and I think it's the most important part of the work that clients leave and they are themselves.
I like that,
Definitely,
Rory.
yeah.
I love that. I love that therapy is finding yourself, not finding solutions, but finding your true self. Within a world that has such mixed messaging. It also occurs to me that when we speak about external locus of evaluation, it's very easy to look at external locus of evaluation as being negative. Negativity may be directed at that person, and it can be in many ways. You may have somebody saying, "Oh, well, I'm not very academic." That might be a thing. And then where has that been proven? How has that been proven? Maybe it was just that they have dyslexia, or that their learning style is different, or whatever it is. And it can be, of course, disputed. But the example there is a negative connotation from an external locus of evaluation. But positive external locus of evaluations, or those that appear positive, can also show themselves as distressing. So you might have somebody saying, I shouldn't be feeling like this because I'm really successful, because I've got a really good job and I've got a really good salary and I drive the car that I wanted to have and I live in the house that I wanted to have, but yet I'm feeling blah, 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 blah. And there, the external locus of evaluation indicates that if you've got this kind of a job and this kind of an income and you live in this kind of a house, therefore you're sorted. You should be happy and life should be joyous and free, and you should be damn grateful that you have all those kind of. That is an external locus of evaluation. It's a belief that is set up external to self. The true internal evaluation of that is, I am miserable. I'm miserable in my life, and accepting that and coming to the internal locus of evaluation is at the very minimum a starting point. Seeing it, recognizing it, and being in it. And sometimes life is tough, and sometimes life is unfair, and sometimes things don't go our way, and those expectations we have don't work out. And being in that discomfort sometimes is part of that journey. And it's certainly uncomfortable for me many times where I moved from an external to an internal locus of evaluation. It wasn't a joyous, wonderful, celebratory moment. There can be pain with that. And I recall a client from many, many years ago who, in a breakthrough kind of session, said, I've just realized this is not them. This is actually within me. And for me, that's a celebration of, well, there you go. We've moved from an external locus of evaluation, everything that's happening in my life and troubling me is there and outside of me, to I control this. I take ultimate responsibility. It's a great movement. It's going from that external to that internal locus of evaluation. But this was really tough for that client, and they needed to work through that. But it was a starting point to start working on it, because when all the issues and problems and challenges are external to self, there's not a lot we can do about it. If they could change, and if the job could change, and if my car could change, and my partner could change, then it would be better. Well, they are as they are. So it's only when we move internally that there is any, I guess, road for exploration and development of what that really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also that I wonder what Rogers would have thought of our social media generation, the Instagram generation, the likes generation, because I was out for something to eat with some colleagues, child therapists, recently, and this topic came up, that the selfie isn't my life great Insta generation is conditions of worth and interjected values, and certainly external locus of evaluation writ large. how many people we see on social media who are pointing at their wonderful, flawless lives on cameras and their beautiful travels. And occasionally we pick up very sad stories in the media of social influencers, people who have lived a life across social media, whose life isn't the perfect, filtered story that they've been telling other people. It is very, very different and sometimes quite tragic. And I think that's a parable for our times, Ken.
It is. And on the extreme side of that, people may choose to take their own lives. And on the face of it, when looking back, it looked like everything was fine. And it is that. It's being someone for others, showing everything is great, in this day of skin softening filters, and we're told what we should dress if we're successful, what our body shape should be like. And these messages are coming at us all the time, through the programs we watch, through the media that we consume. It's through the people that the media create as icons and say, these are the people to follow. These are the successful people. And there is vulnerability, I guess, in if I show you who I really am, will you love me? Will I be loved? Will I still be accepted? And sometimes a client will deal with parts of self that are not acceptable even to themselves. I can't accept that part of myself. So how can I dare be like that? How can I dare show that? As a autistic man myself, I have parts of me that I've kept hidden from the world because of how I would be seen, perceived, judged, for that. And you started this, Rory, speaking about masking, and that is a form of masking, and masking is putting on the mask of how I believe the world would want to see me within a given situation, because I can't show my real self because it may not be accepted. And it's interesting because there's a challenge to myself in that as well. It's a great topic, this, and I think that exercise-wise, if you wanted to play around with internal, external locus of evaluation, start with yourself, because the personal development is always a great starter for this. Where within your life are you truly operating from an internal locus of evaluation, being your true organismic self? Where in your life might you be operating from time to time from an external locus of evaluation? Can you spot and pop that in your journal? And then we might look out for, just in day-to-day conversations, people just chatting with us, not in therapy. Are they chatting to us from an external, internal locus of evaluation? And then, of course, within our therapy room, when we see a client bringing something, where are they? Is that internal, external locus of evaluation? What can we do? How can we be patient? How can we show that unconditional positive regard within that transaction? That's the topic, I guess, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think probably finish on that with a very simple observation from one of my favorite songs, Supersonic by Oasis. It starts off by saying, you got to be yourself. You can't be no one else. And I think there's never a true word been spoken. I think that sums it up, Ken.
Yeah. Reminds me of a Cat Stevens song where he says, and I found myself one day when I wasn't even trying. So the whole song's about personal development, how he was on this road to find out and learn and reading all the books. And he found himself one day just in quietness. It's interesting. There I am. This is the real me. That is external, internal locus of evaluation. Two colleagues having a bit of a chat about it. Rory's provided and made up a beautiful handout for you. So you can get Rory's lovely quote, and you can get the handout by going to counsellingtutor.com. That's our mother website. Click on the podcast tab. Make your way to episode 257. Go and download that. Have it on hand. It's got everything we've spoken about beautifully précis. It's got some great references in there as well. So if you are a student and you need to write assignments, it's a good document to be able to reference because you have the actual references from the books there. And that brings Theory and Practice to a close for today. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. And we move on to practice today, Rory, where we look at contemporary issues, challenges, and wins that we may experience in counselling, and something that, if it hasn't happened to you and you're in practice, it will one day. It's just the law of averages. It's meeting a client in a social setting, in any setting that is outside of your therapy room. It can even be walking down the road and they're walking towards you and they're going to walk past you. What do? Do you greet them? Do you not greet them? There's the topic, Rory.
Absolutely. And this comes up from time to time in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. We're a closed group, but knock on the door. Our friendly moderator will let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people, all talking about topics in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have qualified colleagues, we have supervisors, and we also have trainers, and there's lots of topics and lots of information, and it's a very, very supportive group. So if you're not in, knock on the door, come and join the party. And it's meeting a client in a social setting. And I think that this is a really interesting topic. And I think when we start to think about this, we start to think about it in training. When I taught, I used to say to my students before they went into practice, you need to have a conversation with your nearest and dearest, or whoever your nearest and dearest is, and say there are some parts of your life now as a therapist that you cannot share. So I've been a therapist for nearly 2 decades now. And my wife, who's next door, doesn't know anything about my practice or my clients. And sometimes I work online and I'll come out and she'll go, all right, I'll go, yep. And that'll be the beginning and the end of the conversation. And if anybody asked her what I did, the best she could say is, well, Rory goes into a room for an hour and comes out. Or when I was working face to face, Rory gets in his car, drives out, comes back, 2 hours later, or half a day later, depending on practice. So I think it's a conversation to be had. And the reason I ask people to have this conversation is that, think of a scenario like this. You are out in your day-to-day work, day-to-day life. You may be out going for coffee with your partner, and all of a sudden you bump into someone, and that somebody starts talking to you. And your partner says, who was that? Who was that? What are you going to say? And I usually say nowadays, for a long time, oh, it's just someone I know. And my wife knows that's a cue to end the conversation. There's no sort of, who is it? And certainly if I might bump into a female client, there's no, well, how did you know that person? You could see some of the conversations developing. Well, where did you meet her? And certainly if someone was insecure, and certainly my wife isn't on that spectrum whatsoever, it could be, well, who's that? Why are you talking to that person? So I think it's about getting your chickens in a line, ducks in a row, as I like to say, before you start. And I think also it's about thinking about how you're going to engage with somebody you're working with in a different setting. And I can remember many years ago when I used to enjoy the real ale. I've been teetotal for over a decade now, but I used to like going to the Canal Festival with the music and working my way down the real ale bar. And I can remember one particular day, shall I say that I was a little bit wobbly Bob after imbibing the bar, and I bumped into my client. And I sat down and I thought to myself, this is going to be an interesting conversation when we meet on Monday. And the client came in and said, I saw you down the bar. You looked like you didn't enjoy the ale. And I said, yeah, I like real ale and, Cal Festival and the music and all that. And I kind of took the opportunity to say, I wonder how it feels to see me outside the therapy room. And it was really telling. And he said, it's really good. You're just a human being, aren't you? And I said, yeah, pretty much. And that was left at that. And we moved on. But I do think that, it needs to be managed. And one of the things it speaks to, of course, is dual relationships. There's one thing, meeting a client, bumping into them by accident, as I did. It's a completely different thing if you're in a situation where you may be working with your client. What happens if you're a counsellor and you've got another job, and then one day you introduce to your new colleague, and your new colleague happens to be a client? It has happened. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you're out in a social setting, you're doing a hobby, and you find that, when you turn up, there is a client. How do you manage that? And that lives, I think, in preparation, as I've spoken to, I've alluded to, but also I think in the contract. Saying at the time of contracting, if we meet outside, and explaining, what the boundaries are, and how and the client agreeing to that. And in my experience, if you do that, clients are okay. They want to get on with their own lives. They probably don't want to spend time with their therapist outside the therapy room. But it does take some consideration, Ken.
Yeah, I think that this is a really, really important consideration. And you're 100% right, Rory, in that this lives in the contract. It lives in the contract. And if it's not in your contract, maybe it's time to revisit that contract. Because when you bump into the client in a social situation, it's already too late if the rules of engagement have not been predetermined and agreed to. So you mentioned, Rory, from your frame of reference, that you might meet a client and maybe they say hello and you say hello back. And you mentioned that maybe your significant other, Mrs. Counselling Tutor, might say, "Oh, who is that?" Well, the other side of that coin is if that client is with somebody else and we say hello to them and the client says hello back, and then their person that's with them says, "Who is that?" That might put the client in a position where they have to lie, because they may not want the person to know that they're in therapy. It could be uncomfortable. They may need to divulge that they're in therapy, and we don't ever want a client to be in that kind of a position. And that is sorted in the therapy room right in the beginning when contracting. And within my contract, certainly the wording was that if I should see you outside of our therapy setting, I will not acknowledge you unless you come to me. So if I'm walking down a street and on the same side of the street a client walks past, I will not make eye contact. I'll see them, obviously. I won't make eye contact. I will not smile. I will not acknowledge or say hello in any way, shape, or form unless they say hello and instigate with me. If they say hello and instigate with me, then that is their prerogative, and I'm okay to hold a small talk conversation and say hello, how are you, and then manage my side of things, as you said with your wife, Rory. The same is true with mine. She just doesn't ask anymore. It's been explained. Yes. But putting it in and asking the client what they might prefer as well. But yeah, just even acknowledging somebody, just smiling at them, waving at them across a room could open a door for them that they don't want opened. It kind of could break confidentiality in a way. Just a smile, a glance, and a wave could break confidentiality for that person if they're with someone who's going, "Who is that? Who is that man over there waving at you?" Or "Who is that lady over there waving at you and smiling at you?" So to avoid that, pop it in your contract.
Absolutely. And there can be clear and present danger if a client is experiencing domestic violence, or a controlling relationship. The last thing you want to do is compromise the client, because the partner may not know they're going to therapy. And also, I think it's really important to explain the reasons why. I can remember explaining to a client that I wouldn't acknowledge them unless they acknowledge me, and they were a bit taken aback by it. Well, why not? We know each other. And I said, well, I don't know how much you've told the person you're with, you see, and you might not want the person to know that you've come to therapy. Not that there's anything wrong with coming to therapy, but that's your choice. Oh yeah, I never thought of that. And I think that by explaining it, and I think the other crucial element here is, you do meet a client in a social setting, when you get back and you've got a few minutes, put it in your notes.
Oh, yes.
Pop it in your notes. Put it in and say, I bumped into the client in the social setting, brief overview of what happened, leave it just in your notes as an addendum to your notes. Now, it might be that it just sits there forever and then eventually the notes are destroyed after 6 years or however many years your insurance company asks you to keep notes. But if a complaint's raised and the client says, oh, well, I was out and my therapist started talking about therapy and da-da-da-da-da, if you produce your notes and say, I made some contemporaneous notes at the time, or notes at a little distance after the event, that really stands as a key piece of evidence. It shows thoughtfulness of a practitioner, that they've been thorough and diligent enough to see that there could be a potential issue, that they've addressed it in their notes. And I think that would go well if there was any complaints. So it would certainly add to the body of evidence in your favour. And I think, a client making a complaint like that would be very, very, very few and far between. But it just goes to show the amount of forethought we need right from our first times in training and setting that up with the people close to us, right through to being thoughtful and how we engage with a client if we meet them in a social setting, then continuing that to making sure our notes reflect that, and that we've acted with due diligence and professional, in a professional way.
That's it, isn't it? It's that deliberate practice, again, thinking about it before you find yourself in that situation, planning how that might play out, putting it in your contract, educating the client about why that is there, that you're not being rude, that it is there for their protection and well-being. And the last thing you want is to find yourself in a situation where it just plays out, because it's a law of averages. The world is a very small place, and if it did play out, I could think of nothing worse than finding myself in a position where maybe I instate, oh, hello, oh, it's lovely to see you, and then ending the conversation with something like, well, I'll see you on Monday at the regular time, and then, oh, my goodness me, how inappropriate would that be? And, that inappropriateness that I've just mentioned there, I think through those things of what might the scenario play out like in order to avoid them, so I don't just kind of get caught short within the moment. And this can happen in so many ways, and it can be quite unsettling in ways that it can work out. I remember arriving for a CPD for CPD training, and there within the room was an ex-client, and I guess the reason for that, and that is the last thing I expected, and the reason for that is because there was a time that I would offer counselling at a reduced rate for students that were needing to do their required hours. But it's the same thing, it's still a client. And that client could one day, as you say, Rory, be a colleague. And how is that managed? And how do you think about that and contract before finding yourself there?
Yes, and one final element to this that we've not touched on, which is essential, is of course supervision, Ken.
Oh, yes, please.
If you do meet a client in a social setting, put it on the supervision agenda. Again, I think it's good to talk through, because I think we've talked rightly so about the client's perspective. I think that's essential. Ken's really done a deep dive into that. But I think from our own perspective, working through how that might shift the relationship, how that might bring up anxiety in us. I mean, in my own case, my supervisor said to me, so how was it to be kind of, shall we say, like a listing galleon at the bar and your client seeing you? And I said, well, there's very little I could do about it. And I said, I wasn't, I didn't have so much to drink that I was, not cognizant of my actions, but I would have definitely been, shall we say, a little more mellower than maybe the client would have known me. And then, of course, I was with Mrs. Counselling Tutor, and I think he was with my daughter as well, because I think we all went out. It's like a bit of a family thing. And I was pretty cool about it, to be honest. I said, well, I can't change it, And she said, yeah. She said, you've taken the right direction with it. You can't apologise for having a social life. You can't apologise for having, so at the time, social drink. You can't apologise for being out with your family. But what you have to do is try and put some context in that and bracket it.
Yeah.
And if the client struggles with that, bracket it, help the client bracket it. As it happened, it was all good. But yeah, it's the reality of being a therapist and also being, a human being with a life outside therapy, I think.
Indeed. And it's interesting to kind of put a full stop at the end of this topic, because I know we've got to move on to our CPD section. The times change, and we need to revisit our contracts and our ways of working from time to time. And an example of that is social media is now such that you don't have to be out in the street to bump into somebody. You can get a friend request from one of your clients through, I'm just going to pick a platform like Facebook. And I think maybe this is a different topic, but it's very similar. Have you contracted with your client that you will not friend them on social media? A client has the right, and they sometimes do go online and search for their therapist. And how might it be if they send a friend request to you and it is ignored? What might that feel like with them? Maybe they're an ex-client. If you haven't mentioned that or discussed it beforehand, I feel for myself it would not be appropriate for me to have a friend connection on social media with a client, because I have a personal and private life that I share with my friends and family, which is very different to my professional counselling life. But I would certainly be putting that in my contract too. So it's managing the meeting client in a social setting, and of course updating that, making it really current and contemporary, and saying, how does that work online? And that is practice today. Those what happens in counselling, the day-to-day running, I guess. And now on to Practice Matters. That's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. An interview with Tayba Azim. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Rory, and that is supporting Muslim clients with their mental health. You reached out, you did this interview.
Absolutely. I caught up with Tayba, and she spoke about a very important aspect of practice in a secular society, that we may meet clients with a faith position. In this case, it's the Islamic faith position. And as we'll hear, she speaks about what therapists may need to consider when working effectively in a multicultural society. I caught up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
Equality and diversity is at the heart of our profession, and part of taking equality and diversity into your profession and engaging with it and understanding it is to understand how cultures operate and faith systems inform those people who believe and live within those systems. So I'm delighted to welcome Tayba Azim, who has done a fabulous lecture for the Counsellor CPD Library entitled Supporting Muslim Clients and Their Mental Health and Emotional Wellbeing. So Tayba Azim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rory. Thank you.
So I think that possibly one of the issues that therapists, all therapists need to consider, is how much they understand the mechanisms of the faith and cultural positions their clients exist in. And Islam is a growing faith position. It's as established in our society as a faith position. So I guess my first question is, why is it important that therapists understand the cultural and faith positions that their clients may live in and practice in?
In terms of that, it's really important to understand that people are different. People come from various backgrounds, and so what shapes them as an individual who's seeking therapy is family, as we know, relationships, and then communities, and within those communities, then we've got faith. We've got particular cultures as well, and a way of, for Muslims, especially Islam is a way of living and being. So having that understanding is crucial to the client being understood in the therapeutic space.
Yes, and I guess that if you're working with someone who has a faith cultural position, that cultural and faith position is the scaffolding which holds their life experience up. And if we're not careful as therapists, if we don't understand how that scaffolding works, and I'm using a very kind of visual term, scaffolding, we could bump into it and dislodge the scaffolding, or even worse, the client may feel that they're not being heard. So in terms of working with Muslim clients, is there anything that therapists need to be immediately aware of or thoughtful of?
I think just having a general basic knowledge of what Islam is, in terms of one of the lecture that I've done is around the 5 pillars of Islam, which is something that's very universal within all the sects of Islam, as far as I'm aware. So just having that basic understanding on the principles is a starting point in order to help the clients that come and see a therapist, so that the client isn't having to further explain why they're coming from a certain position or certain thought within the Islamic framework.
I think that's really, really interesting, because I've always said that clients shouldn't have to explain or educate clients on their culture, therapists on their culture. The therapist should have some understanding. It doesn't mean, of course, that through the arc of working with a client from a different faith or cultural perspective, or that you don't find things out and you don't enrich your knowledge, but it shouldn't be from the perspective of, what are these 5 pillars of Islam, and then the client having to spend valuable time in therapy explaining them. That work should be pre-done, and you can find that there's lots of authoritative websites that would explain that, I'm guessing.
Absolutely. The 5 conducts, the 5 pillars of Islam, are, as soon as you open a page up in terms of what is Islam on Google or whatever browser you're using, it would generally come up with the fact that there are 5 pillars that we adhere to, or try to rather. And there's something that in this society that we're living in, Ramadan, fasting is one of them. And I would assume generally pretty much everyone is aware that Ramadan, or there is something called Ramadan that occurs once a year. And also in terms of just generally praying. A lot of people are aware that there are prayers, so it's just understanding them on a slightly sort of deeper level. But again, as I said before, each person will come with their life experience, depending on what their upbringing has been like. But in general terms, the basics of the 5 pillars are there within each sect.
Yes, and I think you've touched on a very interesting point. Every Muslim client is an individual. They are a Muslim and they're an individual. So their life experience and their engagement with faith, as with any faith, can vary. So we mustn't stereotype them. We mustn't see people of faith as just one very narrow kind of niche of people. There's a wide array of people within any faith position.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to sort of establish that when you're working with a Muslim client, is perhaps in the assessment, do they belong to a faith group? Is it religion or is it spirituality? Because there's also a difference in terms of I don't really like the term practicing, but it's what is tended to be used in inverted commas, a practicing Muslim who's adhering to praying 5 times a day, etc. Or is it about spirituality and what they're working on is self-awareness and being conscious and being reflective, which again is a part of Islam as well. And sometimes clients will marry the two, which is what's, which essentially, Muslims do try to adhere to. You've got the practical guidance, and then you've got the spiritual, and you're embodying both of them.
Yes, yes, and again, it comes down to not stereotyping and not seeing individuals just in one element or through one prism. People of faith, people who believe in Islam. They are a wide variety of people who may engage with their faith and their religion in many different aspects. Of course, with Islam, there is the book called the Quran, which is, and you'll have to excuse me if I don't want to offend, but the word of Muhammad was written by Muhammad, and within it outlines certain laws, certainly around things like divorce, sexual intimacy, and that type of thing. Why is it important that therapists understand the mechanisms of Quranic texts when it comes to things like divorce or women's place within that faith position?
Okay, I'm just going to go back a little bit. So it wasn't written by Muhammad. It is something that has come from God. What Muhammad had done is he'd memorized all of this. The Quran, as we see it today, was actually written years later, as far as my understanding is. And that's because everybody had memorized the Quran, and then they wanted to put it in some kind of order, because as human beings, we we need something quite sort of practical and visual rather. So there's that. But what Muhammad did was he embodied to a certain degree the Quran. So it's his teachings that we also follow. So as Muslims, we go back to the basics of you'll find the information in the Quran. And then there's something about looking at the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, which match up with what the Quran. Coming to the rights of women and the chapter, there is a chapter called Women, Surah Al-Nisa in the Quran, and that's dedicated to the rights, basically, rights, roles and responsibilities of women. And it's, that is a really, really important part of Islam. It empowers women. Unfortunately, what we've got, and I should have mentioned this earlier perhaps, is whilst people are coming or adhering to Islam as much as they can, and their relationships with family, culture has a big part to play. So often enough, the Quranic text can be misinterpreted, and culture can be overtaken in terms of that. So some of the Muslim women aren't actually aware of their own rights in Islam either. So in terms of coming into the therapeutic space, it's important for perhaps therapists to understand that Muslim women do have rights. They are empowered. They have a right to education. They have a right to work. Their money is their money, and their husband's money is their money as well. So there are so many things in that. And in terms of divorce as well and intimacy, all of these things have been laid out in the Quran, and the way the Prophet Muhammad embodied that as well shows that in one aspect that Islam came to support and empower women and females, because again, we're looking historically, patriarchy women have been subjugated. So Islam, came in to give women power and freedom. So, yeah, I think it's important in the therapeutic space if a therapist can understand perhaps what roles and responsibilities a Muslim woman has, what her rights are, so that there's something about, again, empowering and supporting the client if they're coming with regards to their self-esteem, if they're coming into therapy with regards to relationships, etc. So even if they're not aware, so much so, a therapist can kind of be curious about it, and even to the fact that my understanding is, I've read this, what are your thoughts on that? So you're kind of exploring that, and you're empowering the client who comes to you.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because I used earlier in the podcast the term causing offence, and I think a lot of people are worried about causing offence. But I think what I'm hearing you saying is if you have the correct information and you can help the clients understand that information, certainly female clients, that's empowerment. Knowledge, as they say, is power. And if I'm hearing you correctly, it would seem that, as in a lot of faith positions, that male dominance, sometimes referred to as the patriarchy, has kind of skewed sometimes the interpretation to disadvantage women. Would that be a correct summary?
Absolutely spot on. There are so many layers in terms of women being dominated, and as I said, some of that can be culture as well, and in the latter sort of years as well, some aspects of colonialism as well have allowed for that. So I think just power, knowledge is power. And what I do say is it can only be more powerful if it's implemented as well.
Yes.
So as a therapist, I myself, I'm involved in activism. I'm an activist. So what I do inside of the room is what I do outside of the room. And with that activism comes sharing that information with my clients who might not be aware.
Yes, and I don't think I'd be doing my job as an interviewer properly if I didn't touch on that aspects of colonialism. What is it about colonialism? And I guess that would be maybe summarised as the domination of white societies over indigenous people. I think that's probably a shortcut. What is it about colonialism that could disadvantage a female Muslim client?
So with colonialism, I think it is in and of itself a huge topic. So Islam generally has been, I would say, a liberating religion for Muslim women. Come colonialism, not only have indigenous communities been subjected to oppression, but then they've left certain remnants of that. So you're dealing, again, it's that crossover with, you've already got patriarchy, you've got some elements of culture, and then colonialism just sort of adds to that as well. And we've got to be very much aware of, perhaps our own prejudices. Where do we fall short in that therapeutic space? I, as a South Asian, Pakistani Muslim woman, if I've got somebody who's African, Caribbean in front of me, what do I know of them? What do I know of their history apart from, enslavement or slavery? What else do I know about it? And that's important. It's important for me to, learn something of that. So again, if we're specifically talking about white therapists in a room with a Muslim woman, do the homework.
Yes.
Have an understanding of not just the faith, but what has colonialism done as well. And I request look within yourself. As much as we can say, we're not racist and we're not judgmental, we're not this. We're human beings at the end of the day. There's so much to learn, and sometimes the more you know, the more you think the more you actually don't know.
Yes. yes. I think it's a very interesting debate and conversation that's had within therapy, and certainly the idea of otherness. The fact that when you meet someone, you're meeting a other, and they're unique in their experiences and their history and what's brought them to be who they are, I think is really, really important for us to grasp as therapists. In terms of the lecture, what do you hope that people will take away from watching your lecture?
That there is actually more to being a Muslim and to Islam than what the media portrays. To be fair, because we can have this sort of subconscious bias in a sense through the media, and this I'm hoping will give some kind of foundation for therapists in order to work with Muslim clients. So you don't necessarily have to be a Muslim to work with your Muslim clients, because the Muslims do have certain things that are already existing. It's just how do they apply that when they're going through the difficulties that they are. So meet them where they're at, and ask them those questions. So do you pray 5 times a day, or do you fast? How do you find that? And through that, you'll begin to garner some kind of understanding of, okay, this is useful to them. So maybe they did it previously, and this is how they felt. And as a reminder, how about, how do you feel about, implementing that again, since, it's something that you found useful. And we talk about meditation, we talk about grounding, and there are so many things that are already there in our practical lives as Muslims that do the grounding work. So if you're meeting them at their level, instead of kind of going, let's do a guided meditation, here's the sun, here's the sea, etc. Maybe that grounded meditation is evolved around pilgrimage, around the Kaaba. So there's something that resonates with them, for the Muslim client, and it feels real. It's something that they can connect to.
Supporting Muslim clients and their mental health and emotional well-being is available in the Counsellor CPD library. And Tayba Azim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Massive thank you to Tayba. Massive thank you for you, Rory, for reaching out and getting all the good interviews in. And of course, if you enjoyed what Tayba said, there is a lecture, a full lecture, and you can find that in our CPD library for qualified practitioners. You log in and that lecture has been placed there for you. If you are not a member of the CPD library and you are a qualified practitioner, go and have a look. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, 1 cup of coffee per month, you can have unlimited access to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lectures and resources from top professionals in their field, all put into a library that is easily searchable, so you can do the CPD that you need at the time that you need it. And to get more information, just go to counsellingtutor.com. Everything is right there on that page. This has been episode 257 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off in theory and practice. We talked about that all-important piece of Rogerian theory, locus of evaluation, both the internal and the external locus of evaluation. In practice today, we talked about the mechanism of meeting a client in a social setting. What do we have to think about? What do we have to prepare for? How do we think about the client's perception of that? And then finally, in Practice Matters, I interviewed Tayba Azim, who talks about supporting clients with their mental health and emotional well-being. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counselor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counsellor CPD library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.